Welcome to the Explainer. Okay, let's dive into this. When we picture a rural hospital, our minds naturally go straight to, well, emergency rooms, local doctors, basic healthcare access. But honestly, that is only half the story. Today, we are fundamentally redefining what these facilities mean to their hometowns. Because rural hospitals, they aren't just places you go when you're sick. They are these massive, foundational economic anchors that literally keep entire regions afloat.
1 in 12. Just think about that for a second. That is the staggering proportion of all rural jobs in the United States that are supported either directly or indirectly by hospitals and healthcare systems. When we shift our perspective away from just looking at medical care and look at local employment instead, we start to see the hospital not as a community expense, but as an employer. And often, they're the biggest employer for miles around.
And this brilliantly illustrates the sheer scale of that footprint we're talking about here. $220 billion. That's the total economic activity that rural hospitals generate nationwide every single year. It's huge. They are constantly pouring capital into local markets, stabilizing housing, and frankly, keeping small-town main streets alive.
So, let's get into Section 1, the hidden engine.
It's a fact that healthcare consistently ranks as the top 3 employer in rural communities, sitting right alongside education and social services. But hospital jobs, they're kind of unique. They bring in these high-tier, incredibly reliable salaries that stabilize local real estate markets. Plus, having a robust hospital acts like a giant magnet. It attracts new businesses because their employees need nearby care, and it draws in retirees. And that's a demographic that really demands reliable medical infrastructure and brings a lot of pension wealth right into the local economy.
Which brings us right to Section 2. Following the healthcare dollar.
So you might be wondering, how exactly does a medical bill or a doctor's salary translate into community wealth? Well, it all boils down to a concept called the economic multiplier. It's basically a ripple effect, where every single dollar spent by a hospital supports additional business activity in the surrounding community. Those healthcare dollars, they don't just stay locked inside the hospital walls. They circulate, they multiply, and they feed a whole bunch of other industries.
Let's move to and see how this builds in real time. It's kind of like a 3-step process. In step 1, the hospital buys services from local vendors, paying construction firms for facility maintenance, local food suppliers, or even laundry services. Then in step 2, the healthcare staff take those high-tier salaries we talked about and spend them at local grocery stores, restaurants, and auto shops. Finally, in step 3, all of this activity grows the local tax base, which then funds public schools and infrastructure. The data actually shows that a single dollar spent by a rural hospital ultimately turns into a massive $2.30 for the local economy.
To put a human face on this, let's just look at the impact of one single person. One rural primary care physician can generate 26.3 local jobs and over $1.4 million in local wages and benefits. So when a town recruits just one doctor, they aren't just getting medical care. They are effectively launching a small business that employs over 24 people. Now, this creates a pretty stark contrast when it comes to the financial health of rural towns. When a hospital offers comprehensive services right there in town, it's called import substitution, basically keeping the healthcare dollars local. But if local care isn't available, residents have to travel to urban centers, and that leads to capital leakage through something called bypass behavior. Think about it. When a family has to drive an hour to the city for a procedure, they're also buying their gas, eating their lunch, and doing their retail shopping in that city. The rural town literally bleeds money.
Which begs a very provocative and honestly very urgent question. What happens when the anchor is lifted? What exactly happens when these vital economic engines just shut down?
That brings us to Section 3.
the anatomy of a closure. So the crucial point is this isn't just theoretical. This is immediate, measurable economic devastation on a community. When a rural hospital closes, the average per capita income of the entire town drops by 4%. That is roughly $703 per person gone. Local unemployment spikes by 1.6 percentage points. And health sector jobs, they plummet by 14% almost overnight. And unfortunately, this is happening at an alarming pace. If we look at a recent policy brief by the National Rural Health Association, rural America is facing a record rate of hospital closures. We're talking over 150 rural facilities shutting their doors since 2005. It's a trend that is systematically destroying high-quality jobs across the country.
The loss of a hospital triggers this brutal downward economic spiral. It's a true domino effect. First, the hospital doors close. Immediately, high-wage professionals like surgeons and nurses, well, they're forced to leave town to find work. Specialized care, things like obstetrics and trauma, completely disappears. Then, local businesses, from the corner diner to the local mechanic, they lose a ton of foot traffic. Next, the tax base erodes, which chokes off funding for local schools. And ultimately, the community loses its healthcare cluster entirely, cementing its status as a distressed region. It becomes completely unappealing to any new industries or businesses that might have been looking to relocate there. Marie Berry, the Director of Community Economic Development at the Rural Wisconsin Health Cooperative, she humanizes this heavy data perfectly. She says, if a community is struggling, oftentimes their hospital is struggling. It's a two-way street, a bi-directional relationship. You simply cannot separate the financial viability of a hospital from the overall economic health of the town it sits in. They sink or swim together. Let's pivot to Section 4, Stabilizing the Rural Future. But hey, we aren't just here to admire the problem. We need to look at the structural disadvantages that are unique to rural facilities so we can find proactive solutions. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that in 2023, 44% of rural hospitals operated on negative margins, compared to just 35% of urban hospitals. The traditional fee-for-service model, which absolutely relies on a high volume of patients coming through the door, it simply doesn't work in sparsely populated areas. The math just doesn't add up. So we have to rebuild the foundation. And the good news is there are several innovative models designed to do just that. One approach is the convener strategy, where hospitals step up to actively lead downtown revitalization and even invest in local housing. Another major shift is moving toward global budgets. That's a model that pays hospitals a fixed amount to care for a population, basically decoupling their revenue from sheer patient volume. Then there's the new Rural Emergency Hospital, or REH model. This allows struggling facilities to drop their money-losing inpatient beds, but they receive enhanced funding to maintain that critical 24/7 emergency care. And finally, the Rural Health Transformation Program is injecting $50 billion into structural modernization to upgrade technology and stabilize these local economies. All of these solutions, they're driven by one core realization. Economic development is population health. Protecting rural hospitals is not just some healthcare priority. It's an absolutely foundational requirement for our national economic resilience, our labor force productivity, and honestly, even our food security. Which leads us with this final thought. If economic development truly is population health, can we afford to view rural hospitals as just medical facilities? Or must we protect them as the critical, foundational infrastructure of our communities? It's a question that really challenges us to rethink the true value of our rural healthcare systems. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.